This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to Dialogue. Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva has kicked off his 4-day state visit to China. The highly expected trip is believed to boost bilateral cooperation in a wide range of areas, including economy and trade, as well as emerging technologies. What do closer China-Brazil bilateral ties mean for each of the two emerging economies? And how can the partnership bring more benefits and opportunities to the wider developing world? To help us answer these questions, I'm joined today by Rodrigo Zeidan, Professor of Practice of Economics and Finance at NYU Shanghai, Professor John Gong from the University of International Business and Economics, and José Ricardo Júnior, Co-Chairman and CEO of LIDE China. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Well, welcome to the discussion. Ricardo, I will start with you. So President Lula has arrived in Shanghai with a large delegation of diplomats, politicians, senators, and Congress people, of course, business people too, on Wednesday. So tell us, what's on the agenda of his trip to China?
Hi, Qinduo. Thanks for having me. We are very excited with this visit of President Lula to China, especially because we are now expecting not only to improve the traditional trade between Brazil and China in terms of import and export, but also we are emphasizing the importance that we have in this bilateral strategic partnership in terms of sustainability and technology. In other words, I would say that Brazil is eager to receive technology from China in terms of the electric vehicles and also in terms of the intelligent manufacturing and the sustainable agriculture. So Brazil and China, they have a very bright future in terms of what we consider that it's an important role for Brazil, also in terms of sustainable reindustrialization of our country. It's a win-win partnership. We have to emphasize that Brazil and China are almost completing 49 years in August 2023 of this successful bilateral relationship. And now we are improving our relationship into a new area. So again, we do have this improvement of the business relationship between Brazil and China in terms of import and export, but we are also now developing these strategic areas such as sustainability and innovation. So I would say that not only Brazilian government, but also the Brazilian entrepreneurs, they are excited to talk to China with the government officials and Chinese entrepreneurs of an improvement in the exchange. And we are very happy and we are expecting that Lula and its delegation and his delegation can sign several agreements in order to get closer to China and improve this relationship.
Mm-hmm. Rodrigo, in Shanghai, so we know there's of course almost 3 years of this pandemic disruption, and of course there's a different term from President Bolsonaro, who does politics differently. So, what do you think this recent trip, might reshape the relationship with China?
For sure. What we have to understand is that the previous administration in Brazil had a very histrionic view of other countries, including China. And because of the pandemic as well, Brazil and China grew apart a little bit. But we have to remember that President Lula, his first 2 terms in the early 2000s, they were very successful, and part of that is because of the commodity supercycle due to the growth of the Chinese economy. Brazil and China in 2001, the term BRICS came to fore. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And since then, all these countries, they actually institutionalize a really big relationship between them. We have the New Development Bank, we have other initiatives, we have many partnerships, universities, study abroad students. Yesterday, I learned about exchange of even teachers.
Exchange of teachers, people to people. Obviously, that's also an important part of this bilateral relationship. But John, if you look at the trade relationship between the 2 large developing nations, last year, for example, China imported some 90 billion Brazilian products, especially, of course, soybeans and oils, and exported more than 60 billion to Brazil. So the traded volume, or the total volume of 150 billion, that represents 21 times growth since Lula's first visit to China in 2004. Can we say, of course, the past is glorious in terms of growth. Can we say the potential for next few years or for the future is also massive?
Yeah, what's fundamental about the trade relationship between the 2 countries is that they're very complementary. Brazil is a resource-rich exporting country, just like, say, Saudi Arabia, Canada, Australia. It exports a lot of raw materials as well as agricultural products. Now, by the way, the Chinese imports of soybean from Brazil started out as a result of Donald Trump's imposing trade wars on us. And I think this type of substitution will probably stay there, forever. So, this is what the Americans are asking for, and that's what they get for. But nevertheless, Chinese exports to Brazil has also grown tremendously over the years. Chinese manufactured products, your program mentioned electric cars, for example. These are the things that Chinese companies have a really good competitive advantage. Now, in addition to business and economic relationships, I also want to emphasize the political alignment between the 2 countries. China and Brazil are two of the most important major powers in the what's called the global South. Both are BRIC members. Both countries, extremely important in their role in the developing world. And I think both countries also hold the same position with respect to this war going on in Ukraine. Both take neutrality positions. As a matter of fact, I think it's what's interesting, probably hasn't been reported a lot in the press, is that President Lula even mentioned that he wants to talk to President Xi about collectively, together with a couple of other developing countries, acting as a mediating partners to try to promote peace in the Ukraine war. And I think this is actually a very important message. If you look at what other countries out there that are indeed in a neutrality position, that are entitled to playing a objective role and can be acceptable to both parties. Not many countries out there. And I think Brazil, China, and I think he mentioned Indonesia as well, a couple of other emerging market economies, they collectively speak out on behalf of their camp, our camp indeed, to try to promote peace in Ukraine is something very significant, in terms of international politics in the world stage.
Mm-hmm. Well, Ricardo, of course, we know President Lula has made a history by being the president elected to 3 terms, and also being the candidate to unseat incumbent president. When he was, of course, elected as Brazil's president again last October, he said in his victory speech, "Today we say to the world that Brazil is back," end quote. The question is like Brazil is back from where and what his domestic agenda?
Well, actually, President Lula is now reconnecting Brazil with the world, reestablishing the diplomatic ties, and also promoting business with our friend countries. So, in other words, I would highlight that this special visit to China is one of the strategic goals of Brazil. And we want to show, as China shown to Brazil before with the visit of the Vice President Wang Jishan, when he came to Brazil when Lula was elected in his third mandate. Now Lula is paying a visit to China in order to reestablish and reinforce the importance of the ties, the bilateral ties between Brazil and China. We have to highlight that we do have a special commission in the political area, which is subdivided in 12 groups in terms of economy, in terms of education, in terms of aerospace, in terms of culture, in several other important subjects, which in a way somehow Brazil and China discuss what are the challenges and what are the opportunities to be connected. So it's a very important visit. Brazilians are paying close attention to this visit of President Lula to China, because we do expect that we are going to have a lot of different projects to be developed here, especially in terms of technology and in terms of sustainability. We have to remind that Brazil was considered by China we established our ties, our diplomatic ties in 1974, but in 1993, China considered Brazil a strategic partner, and in 2012, China considered Brazil a global strategic partner. So now it's time for us to step forward and discuss, for example, the importance of Brazil to analyze the political subject in terms of the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. This is something that we are paying attention very closely, because definitely the Belt and Road Initiative can be a way of us to get closer and to receive more foreign direct investments from China into Brazil.
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, the cooperation, both sides, you see the desire, and which has been very productive, and there's a lot of potential, including the cooperation in the technology sector. Rodrigo, you are in Shanghai, and President Lula arrived. His first destination is in Shanghai. He visited the innovation center of Huawei technology, and there's a U.S. media report with a headline like a stop in Huawei that may irk the U.S. Why the U.S. would be concerned with a visit by President Lula to Huawei?
Well, Brazil is gonna. We have 5G and 6G technologies in the future, and Brazil is gonna open to China and is gonna open to Huawei to bid on telecommunication services in Brazil. In a way, is as simple as that. Is the fact that Brazil wants investment from China, and unlike the U.S., Brazil has absolutely no problem with Huawei investing in Brazil. This geopolitical fears, Brazil is not. Brazil is as you mentioned before, Brazil is a neutral country in many aspects, including geopolitics. Brazil is not aligned with the U.S. in many areas, and certainly not in this decoupling with China. So Brazil has actually a trade surplus with China. China is one of the most important strategic partners of Brazil. So visiting companies such as Huawei that can invest in the country is only natural. It's something that wouldn't make the news 10 years ago or 5 years ago or 2 years ago, and is only making the news because the Americans are targeting Huawei and other Chinese companies.
I mentioned the U.S., of course, it's not only about China, Brazil, but also, the world is watching the visit, which is important, of course. And before the visit, actually, there's an agreement between China and Brazil, John, that is to use their own currencies to settle trade. So basically, by avoiding the use of dollar, of course, that will facilitate trade between the two countries. And in his visit to the new development bank, which whose headquarters is in Shanghai, President Lula talked about the BRICS countries, which the large developing nations, Brazil, China, Russia, India, and South Africa, they can do something probably to increase the use of their own currencies, if not a common currency instead of dollar. What do you make of these efforts?
So this is not as important as it seemed at first.
Well,
this is something that is a
Ricardo,
first step.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, Ricardo. You can. Yeah.
Is the first step in a long line of insurance against the U.S. dollar as the main currency of trade in the world. And the idea here, but we have to understand that in the beginning this is going to be very small, because neither the Brazilian real or the Chinese yuan are fully convertible currencies. As you mentioned correctly, this is something that is going to facilitate trade, but it's not going to facilitate trade to the extent that we're going to have Chinese banks that want to hold the Brazilian currency, because there's not many reasons for that, or vice versa in the beginning. This, a little bit, is a way to buy insurance against, for instance, potential sanctions from the U.S., economic sanctions, even though I don't think that is a huge possibility, not against Brazil and not against most of China. The U.S. and China have huge relationships as well. But it still is something that is a first, is a beginning of the internationalization of the yuan. The yuan is now part of the IMF basket of currencies. But again, the yuan is still a non-convertible currency. This is going to be more important in the future. So it's a first step. It's a first step in strengthening the ties, but it's not, as the Brazilian president indicates, it's not something that is going to make trade between the BRICS countries all happen in their local currencies, because it doesn't work like that. Mm-hmm. It's going to take some time. It's going to take years or maybe decades. Okay. But again, not a problem.
Yeah. John Gong, this is the first step in a long process, I guess. But still, if you look at the response from some of the U.S. politicians, they are very sensitive to this. For example, Marco Rubio, the senator, said in the short video that in 5 years' time, the U.S. will not be able to impose sanctions on countries probably like China and Brazil. Should we be afraid of the lack of sanctions from Washington?
Well, I would give credit to Senator Marco Rubio. At least he's very honest, because when he thinks about other countries trading with currencies other than the U.S. dollar, he was immediately thinking about the U.S. inability to impose sanctions. That speaks volume about his thinking, about about his view of the world. Nevertheless, he can do whatever he wants, and he can think whatever he wants. But the fact of the matter is, trade between Brazil and China doesn't have to necessarily go through a third party's currency. And I have to refer to the history that Brazil in the past has experienced several times of balance of payments problems. And that's largely attributed to its external debt in U.S. dollar, and every time U.S. dollar appreciates as a result of Fed's raising interest rates, as what's being done right now, Brazil gets into a huge problem. So I think it's a good thing that both countries are gradually, at least as a first step to move towards a regime that the bilateral trade can be settled at least partially with a currency other than U.S. dollar. Brazil doesn't have to be too much concerned about this because Brazil enjoys a fairly considerable trade surplus with China. Exports to China is $90 billion, imports is only $60 billion. So, it's actually getting RMB in return for its trade surplus. And given RMB's relatively stable history in the last decade, I think it's a fairly safe investment in holding RMB. As a matter of fact, I also want to point out that Brazil is one of the few countries that has its foreign exchange reserve has the highest percentage being holding RMB in its foreign exchange reserve. That tells a lot about its confidence in RMB. So I think this is something naturally going to develop, and I would see that RMB's usage will further increase in the future, particularly with respect to the trade as well as actually tourism from China. I think it's it's very natural for Chinese tourists, more and more Chinese tourists visiting Brazil and spending money with RMB. Given the fact that there's already they're going to establish a clearinghouse, RMB clearinghouse in Brazil. So that's more convenient, and it makes it's a good thing for both countries.
Well, Ricardo, from the IIDE, of course, we are talking about the facilitating trade, more trade between the two countries. President Lula also talked about a possible free trade deal between China and Brazil. Of course, with a large picture in the thinking is the common southern market. How likely is it in near future, for example?
Well, I think that John well said that, for example, this possibility of using the yuan in the trade between Brazil and China is an alternative. We are not telling, we're not expressing that the US dollar will be replaced by yuan, but it's important to highlight that it's going to give speed for the trade between Brazil and China. So it's going to be quicker, the negotiation, the import and export. And also, in terms of costs, it's going to be better for the Brazilian and the Chinese business people to use yuan in this trade. When we talk about the past, in the early 2000s, we had not more than $3 billion US between China and Brazil. And how now is the trade between Brazil and China? If you see, for example, 2018, we had almost $100 billion US between import and export between Brazil and China. In 2019, almost reached it again, $100 billion US. In 2020, we during the crisis, the pandemic, we reached 102 billion. In 2021, we reached 130. Now in 2022, last year, the trade between Brazil and China was of 150 billion US dollars. So again, the use of RMB would be very positive for this relationship, because we're going to have an alternative to use RMB in the import and export. We're gonna have a better alternative in terms of speed and in terms of costs. So this agreement that was established between Chinese central bank and Brazilian central bank definitely is a very positive step forward of this relationship. As President Xi Jinping already said, that we live in a global village, and it's a time to develop this common shared future. And common shared future in this Pacific development can somehow be expressed by the use of the RMB in spite of the dollar, the American dollar, in the trade between Brazil and China.
Mm-hmm. Rodrigo, in Shanghai, of course, we mentioned briefly about the possibility of Brazil, China, and other developing countries working together to improve the peace prospect in Ukraine. What can we do? What can, for example, China and Brazil do? Their leadership can do to probably help stop or achieve a ceasefire.
I think China can do a lot. I don't think Brazil can do a lot. I think Lula wants to be part of this process, but really this is a process that should be led by China. China and Russia are much closer allies, economic allies, than Brazil and Russia or Brazil and China. They share a border. So I believe that China has a huge role to play in promoting peace in Ukraine. You are absolutely correct. Both Brazil and China are neutral, and that is very, very important. Lula can help, but Lula cannot lead. It has to be, in my view, it has to be President Xi Jinping that mediating the peace. Yes, he can certainly do that. China has the clout, has the importance, has the Chinese economy is 10 times the Brazilian economy. It's a much bigger country, much more important country to Russia than Brazil. And Russia will listen to China much more than it's going to listen to Brazil.
Mm-hmm. Well, Russia will probably listen more to China. But John, what about, let's say, Europeans and Americans? Will they be ready to accept mediation efforts from developing countries like Brazil, like China?
Well, first, let me say that I think it's a very interesting idea proposed by Lula that a collection of a few countries, major powers in the developing world, to come out and try to mediate a peaceful solution. I think this is an immensely interesting idea. It's something probably weighs more than an individual country trying to persuade President Putin to change his mind. But nevertheless, I think the question about whether the West, whether the European Union and the United States would welcome an effort like this. Honestly, I think there's probably a difference between Brussels and Washington. I think at least from the European perspective, it is genuinely interested in seeking a ceasefire in Ukraine right now, and certainly China has the same view. But I'm not sure Washington has the same view, actually. Washington at least has the record of killing at least one negotiation effort that was taking place in Turkey last year. And clearly, I think UK and United States would be very interested in pushing for a long-term war in Ukraine. But I think at least there's something in common between the European side, at least the European Union side, and China. And certainly, I think Brazil is certainly on the same camp. It's in this country's interest to see a ceasefire in Ukraine right now, as soon as possible.
Mm-hmm. Ricardo, briefly, what do you see the prospect of China, Brazil, and other big developing nations like Indonesia, probably South Africa, playing a role to help achieve a ceasefire, if not a peace deal there?
Well, definitely we do have a bright future. What Xi Jinping is always emphasizing is that we are remodeling the global governance. So Brazil, China, the BRICS countries, the BRICS plus, we do have voice now. We have a strong communication channel, and we are showing to the world that throughout the Pacific development, for sure, we can reach this bright common share future that is always highlighted by President Xi Jinping.
Mm-hmm. Well, with that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. Thank you for being with us. I'm Qinduo. See you next time.